Good. Before we start the panel discussion, which we need to get to quickly, I really think it's important at these Marine Mammal Commission meetings to hear from others other than those at the front table. So those of you who were here before the coffee break, if you had questions for the speakers or consequent to the discussion after the speakers, could you let me know? I don't see any hands, but there's one. Please tell us who you are and give us your question. Thanks.
Hi, yes, I'm Miyoko from the Center for Biological Diversity, and I would like to ask Dan Lawson what it is that NMFS is doing with respect to responding to the West Coast whale entanglements beyond just the research, but on the sort of regulatory side.
Well, I think what you are seeing is what we're doing here in terms of working in concert with the various working groups, up and down the coast, to have, the industry, the state managers, since the majority of these are state fisheries that are involved in these entanglements. So I think, serving as, really a conduit of all of our scientific information into these working groups, everything that we are learning from the entanglements, since we're the ones who are the main, holders and recipients of the entanglement reports and the data that we have, that we provide. So, I mean, that's where our effort has really been focused in this collaborative nature, again, on a coast-wide basis, to try and reduce, the problem.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else out there in the audience, so-called? Okay, if not, we'll get going with the panel discussion, and we have some questions on the screen, as usual with a panel discussion. We have two new participants, and one is Sheila Garber, and she's the person, our representative from the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group, I guess the equivalent of the group in California. And then we have Dan Ayers, who's from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he is on the Washington Whale Entanglement Working Group. So before we start the panel discussion, I'd like each of them to have an opportunity to say a few words, if they wish. Sheila?
Is it on? Okay. My name is Sheila Garber. I have been in the industry for over 40 years. I currently work for a marine and industrial supplier in Astoria, Oregon. I've been there for 21 years. I work a lot with the commercial fishermen, both on the purchasing and sales end. I'm also involved in the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group and on the Columbia Rivers Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. Primarily, I've been working on the entanglement issue for quite a few years with Dan Lawson and Lauren Says. My part has been trying to bring kind of the NOAA folks and the fishermen together and try to make sure everybody's aware of the entanglement issues and getting the fishermen involved in the process.
So I'm also not only involved in the Washington Whale Working Group, but I'm the coastal shellfish manager for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in that capacity, I manage our coastal shellfish, our coastal Dungeness crab fishery. And it was touched on earlier how important that fishery is, but to give you a sense of the magnitude, it is the largest commercial fishery that we manage in Washington State. And I think that's probably also true in Oregon and in California. The ex-vessel value annually can be as high as $56 million. That's money in the pocket of a fisherman. That's not after any of that crab's been produced or processed. And it's the main employer of our small coastal communities in Washington State. And our coastline is very different than the Oregon coastline, certainly different than the California coastline. It's not very well populated. These small communities depend heavily on fishing, and Dungeness crab in each of those ports is definitely the king. And I think it's also important for you to know that all three states have authority to manage this fishery in federal waters. So that's why it's not managed by the Federal Fishery Management Council. We have authority from Congress, and it was just recently renewed in September, or August actually, of this last year by the Dungeness Crab Management Act. And we do that in cooperation with each other. And we do that through the Tri-State Dungeness Crab Committee that's housed and funded by the Pacific Marine Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And we meet regularly, and this is a hot topic of discussion. We have a meeting planned in July to talk about it again. And I will point out that the Washington Whale Working Group is just getting started. One of the differences of crab fishery in Washington is we have the component of tribal fisheries. We have 3 coastal tribes on the coast that have federally adjudicated fishing rights, so we have regular agreements with these tribes to co-manage these fisheries in specific areas. And our whale working groups were a little slow getting going because we needed to make sure that tribal fishermen were involved as well, because whale don't know the difference between state gear or tribal gear, and that has happened. And that whale working group is funded by a grant that NOAA has provided to the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission from their, what is that called? Bioengineering. Yeah, BRAP. Yeah, maybe you all know what that is. I'd have to look it up. But an engineering program specifically designed to look at engineering gear to reduce bycatch. And that same program funded the work that Jeff and Dick mentioned earlier in California, testing some ropeless gear. And it's also funding a workshop that will be held in Long Beach, California, with representatives from fishermen and managers from all 3 states and the tribes joining together in Long Beach to work more on the problem. And I will say this is a very hot issue right now in Washington. Since April 1, we've had 6 entanglements of Dungeness crab gear, 2 confirmed deaths. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong. The most recent one was Tuesday morning, washed up on a beach that I happened to be working on very early Tuesday morning. I saw the animal. So it's definitely got the attention of our fishermen.
Thanks. Following up Peter's question earlier about the scale of the density of traps out there, and we heard from California. Can you guys tell us how it looks in Oregon?
Our coastline's smaller. We only have 200 licensed fishers. We estimate if all those fishermen were using all their pot limit, there'd be about 100,000 pots in the water. And in the densest areas, our fishermen are required to have a logbook and report their fishing location and other things in their logbook. But we can look at that logbook and we can tell you that in the densest areas at the beginning of the season, it's about 60 pots per square mile is the density. And you know, I think that's also important to point out that the season runs from around the 1st of December, sometimes a little later, depending on how quickly crab recover from the molting period. In Washington, it ends September 15th, a little earlier in the other 2 states. But 80% of the catch is in the bank, and most of the fishing has occurred by April 1. So most fishermen leave the fishery by April 1 and go off to do other things. So that's really the intense period of that fishery is from the first of the year or so until about April 1. And I'm sure that's really similar in Oregon and California as well. So.
Okay, Sheila, do you want to say anything about that, or is that covered?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but it is very similar in Oregon. And also, too, I know there were some questions at the break, just real quickly. The Dungeness crab fishery is a single pot fishery. It's 1 pot and a rope, a couple buoys at the surface. When we talk about strings, like Dick talked about earlier, it is just a string of individual pots, and we don't do the trawling up like they do on the East Coast with multiple pots.
Okay, I think it'd be great if I suspect some of the panelists have questions for one another, and feel free to ask them and pursue topics. I don't see anybody jumping at that chance. Does anyone out there want to raise the subject? Robert?
Yeah, thanks. Interesting discussions this morning, and it does seem like kind of entanglements on the West Coast is becoming a larger and larger problem. And obviously with humpbacks, we've talked about a lot, and a little bit with blue whales. I was struck, though, by Karen's statement this morning that gray whales really wasn't a concern or an issue. And I say that from the perspective of having sat through many discussions about the macaw proposed hunt and the amazing decision tree that was put together to avoid potentially taking Pacific Coast Feeding Group or Western gray whales. And it seems like entanglement of gray whales along the West Coast has a potential to take some of those animals. And so the question is really, what is NMFS doing to evaluate the risk to Western gray whales and Pacific Coast Feeding Group animals from entanglements.
Thank you.
Let me just say, from a point of view in terms of the incoming reports, certainly we evaluate each and every little ounce of information we can get from them, and that's one of our primary things is, are we getting good documentation such that we can identify, not just the species, but of course the population as well. So certainly we aimed to increase that becoming a real feature of any response or any report, is to make sure we're getting as much documentation as we can. And so certainly we've been working with folks like Cascadia and sharing, hey, here's what we're seeing in terms of entanglements. Can we identify which population they belong to? So I'd say we're sort of in the midst of doing that. We gave them last year sort of our entire entanglement catalog, if you will. We're awaiting sort of some final information from there. I know John has maybe presented some of that in various meetings in terms of how many individuals we see that would be Pacific Coast Feeding Group. To my knowledge, we haven't identified a Western Pacific yet. So at least from that point of view, that's a focus to try and answer for each and every entanglement. Is it one of those other populations, or is it the Eastern North Pacific? And I assume that information will make its way into, as we really get it, into the stock assessment reports and the things of that nature.
Karen, you going to say something? Francis? Sorry.
Just I think, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of the working group here. Let me know if I'm not. But there's generally, I think, a sentiment that even though while humpbacks are, I think, the focus and Dungeness crabgear is the focus, the idea was to actually try to develop our framework, looking at that species and that fishery because they're the most obvious and kind of timely risk and concern. But I think the idea has always been, and I think there's been a sentiment on the working group, that even gray whales, I mean, I don't remember how high the Eastern Pacific potential biological removal is, but it's pretty high. But we don't even want to come close to that. And there's a concern, I think, about gray whales, about other species, in terms of even there's a lot of sentiment that even one is too many, and there's a lot of market concerns with the regular catch of some of these other species as well. So I hope the take-home message is not that we don't care about gray whales. I think the idea is that the focus is initially limited in scope, with the hope that then we can expand the same framework to deal with some of these other species as well. But gray whales is specifically part of the working group's charge, and I think a very focal area because it's something that we want to reduce even if there's not a population concern.
Robert, do you want to follow up? Then Francis. Just a second, Francis. Robert has a follow-up.
Yeah, I did. And for western gray whales, the population is, 140 or 150, something like that. And so, the PBR on that group is 1, probably. And I know that if the macaw were to accidentally take one gray whale, that the hunt would be shut down for some period of time if that hunt ever actually gets approved. And so just the conservation concern of the potential of taking 1 or 2 single western gray whales or from the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is necessary. And so Dan, it's great to hear that a lot of information is going to make it into the SARS, but do you know if genetic samples are being taken or photographs are being taken of dead whales? I know there's complications with the photographs, but it seems like that information would be helpful to assess whether animals, what group gray whales are actually coming from.
Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about is, live animals, dead animals, whenever we have entanglements and stuff. I mean, we're gathering that information, evaluating it all. So I think we're doing what we can. I think the genetic sampling part is an area that we're getting renewed focus in terms of the response. And I can't speak exactly to all maybe the permitting issues that may be involved with responders taking samples and things like that. But I mean, I know that's something we are aiming to improve our capability even for live animals to be able to get those genetics. So I mean, I think that's certainly an area of active focus and discussion, and even currently with regard to the photos and things like that, we are getting them, we are evaluating them, and that's make the most out of that information that we can.
Francis.
I think just to follow up on Rob and Dan's point, so in my other hat, I go out and cut up dead whales, and certainly at the moment, it's actually really hard to identify an individual grey whale. We even had the famous one with a bed head on its bed that went all the way up the coast. But once they die, they slough the skin, the back looks different, and all the stranding network responders do take skin for DNA that gets shipped to Southwest Fisheries Science Center. So I think we have a very good network. What we don't have is the actual communication or any sort of time frame on when those samples get looked at. So maybe Karen can correct me, but my understanding is the samples go into the archive, and unless somebody actually asks, hey, was that whale, a western grey whale, no one's actively doing that. So it might be a good recommendation from this meeting to suggest that all the skin samples from stranded grey whales do get screened to look at stocks, because I'm not under the impression that that actually happens. But it could happen.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, you're correct, Francis. We do not automatically process samples that come in. We need a request that it be done and funding to do it, which we don't have. Amy Lang is in the room, so she can pipe up if I fill in the gaps here, but I don't believe at this point we have the ability to reliably assign animals genetically to the western gray whale population. We could do a probabilistic assignment, but it would be based on nuclear markers, which it's really extremely inefficient to do that on sort of a one-off. So this pilot project we've got going for the humpback whales is to be able to do that for mitochondrial data. I won't get into the technical details, but we have an idea for how we can do that pretty quickly for individual samples. But that would be much harder to do for the western gray whales because they're just not as different genetically from the eastern gray whales as the different humpback breeding populations are.
Yeah, Amy, how much of what proportion of the western gray whale sockland population do you have at Southwest Center genetic samples from? Do you know? This is Amy Lang from the Northeast Center, Northwest, whatever you. Where are you from? Okay.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm Amy Lang from Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and I've done a lot of the genetic work on the gray whales. And through 2007, we had about 83% of the photographically identified western gray whales genetically sampled. But that proportion has gone way down in recent years because we don't have as active biopsy program over there. So we still have a lot of the reproductive females in the group sampled, so we might be able to assign calves to mothers there, but our overall proportion is probably closer to 50% or less now.
Okay, Francis, did you want to say something more about that?
The Pacific Coast Feeding Group. I don't know how much we can do there as far as assigning dead whales to that group.
Yeah, so genetically it's a similar story, but more difficult because they're even less different from the rest of the Eastern Pacific group than the Western are.
I just want to point out how actually rare it is that we have dead whales entangled on the beach. That's quite a rarity. This year, with some exception, but we've had entire years, and including during these massive reporting spikes, with most all of them, if not all of them, being of live animals seen. So that to me, very valuable question, but the bulk of everything actually involves live animals seen in the water.
Is that? Oh,
I guess that begs a question. You mentioned the macaw. If they were ever caught a western gray whale, they'd be in big trouble. How would they know if we don't have the genetic ability to distinguish them? Is it based on photo ID, or how would that be distinguished in another context?
Yeah, access to photo catalogs is important, and that's part of the structure of this management plan that's been developed by the McCaw. I don't want to get us bogged down too much. I mean, it's great to have gray whales in the discussion, but let's not forget about humpbacks and blue whales. Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to clear up one thing with respect to the stock delineation. If you got the go-ahead to do it, how long would it take you to define those, you know, to get out a new definition of the different stocks on humpbacks?
Yeah, so you're asking if the moratorium were lifted and we were able to. So all the data that we need are available. The working group, I think there are some members of the working group here. So they've been making progress. I don't have a good answer because it really just comes down to a group of people agreeing on something. And right now there are disagreements about exactly what the best way to delineate those stocks is. So there are no data impediments. It's just getting the time to get people together and come to an agreement.
Also, let me just say it first, and then I'll ask you, Jason, but I don't want to lose track of mitigation as an issue to talk about. And we don't want to get too deep into just science. But Jason, take us back to science.
No, it's not going to be science,
okay.
Surprisingly. So just following on that question and answer, Karen said in her talk that the agency can't really do anything management-wise until the stock is redefined in the SAR and there's a moratorium. But in fact, these are the affected humpback whale DPSs are manageable under ESA. There are tools under ESA. The blue whales are ESA listed. So I just want to clarify that there's nothing that the agency can do until the SAR is sorted out.
Okay. Dennis?
I'm wondering if we could just get a bit of dialogue going about this issue of slack versus taut lines. So the California Working Group, I believe, has been proceeding in some of the recommendations they've made based on assumption that the probability of entanglement would be lower for a taut line versus slack line. So there's recommendations to reduce the amount of scope in lines and the length of the trailer line, et cetera. But as Tim pointed out, taut lines may create greater injuries and more probability of death therefore. And I'm wondering if we could perhaps get a little dialogue going here about that particular trade-off and how would we resolve that to know whether it's better to go with slack line or taut line or somewhere in between. How taut?
Dick, can you talk to that to begin with, maybe? Put you on the spot?
I would have to reference back to being a diver. And I've said this a number of different times to different people. When as a free diver, in areas where there's, a kelp forest or small kelp or whatever, if there's current flow and that kelp is taut, I can dive through that, and most always that kelp will roll off my arms and legs and so on and so forth, and I'm flipping around and moving all over. And my thought, this is only my personal thought, is that if the line is tight or somewhat tight, and it has less opportunity to wrap around a fin or a baleen or whatever, I would suspect, my feeling is that it would be less likely to occur. What we've done is we've taken, I personally have taken off my leads that are on these lines, so that the line is singular by itself without having little loops in it and so on and so forth. Again, kind of trying to remove that opportunity for it to create that noose type of situation. I think when Tim was talking about the, ganging pots together or the tauter lines and so on and so forth, I thought you were referring primarily to heavier line, is that, am I correct with that?
Not necessarily.
Just taut line in general?
Can you push your, hold on.
So,
Keep your finger on it.
multitasking.
It's a lot to ask, but
I know.
try. Do your best.
You know how, well, you know my brain capacity, Randy. There are two ways to make ropes stiffer. One is materially by making it what they call a hard lay. So I wish I could use both my hands, but if you, thank you. Just envision taking a 3-strand rope and twisting it in opposite directions. That's what's referred to as a hard lay rope. And so that is a material stiffness that's higher. Also, you can change the chemical properties of the strands that go into the rope. The second way, which I think you're probably referring to, is to increase the tension. For example, on the East Coast, by increasing the counter force of the weight at the bottom and the flotation at the top, you can create a rope that's much stiffer. So I was actually referring to both types.
What would be interesting is to be, I mean, how would you know if it worked? You know, I mean, that's to me, that's a big question, because, I mean, if it works, there's no entanglements.
I couldn't agree more with you, which is why there have been a few studies, including one that we supported to actually try and examine this. The study we did is we built an anatomically correct model of a right whale flipper, attached it to a vessel, and just drove it through ropes of different stiffness at some personal risk to the fisherman who was driving the boat. But anyway, what we found was that you can look at, based on where the rope hits the flipper, whether it has a tendency to slide off over the leading edge, or whether or not it becomes lodged in, what do you call that, the armpit? Or
Axilla.
the what?
Axilla.
Axilla.
Axilla. Thank you, Francis and Randy. And what happened was, as we increased the stiffness of the line, we never even got to that point where it slid one way or the other, because it would just saw right into the tissue. And there are also 2 other studies that have increased tension of rope and found that usually using actual whale tissue, that found more severe lacerations that cut right through the blubber into the tissue of the whale. That was done by Becky Woodward and somebody else. Anyway, it's referenced in my talk.
So Tim, on the East Coast, I'm curious at sort of what's been done about, let's just say, the profile of the line. So we started off very early on here, even just a more basic question, if by, reducing the amount of slack line, would that actually change the profile in any way? So a little bit different than just it being stiff or not stiff, but in terms of profile, in the water, you can imagine just even like an area that's potentially encounterable, loops, those sorts of questions about what the profiles of various lines and potentially reducing the slack of them. Been engaged in some effort to try and measure that under various configurations using floating line, sinking line, things like that. Don't have any real answers yet of what those profiles, how dynamic they are. I'm just curious if anyone on the East Coast has really even looked at, just from a profile point of view, the influence of slack, and if there's anything at all that, does it even make a difference? Does, current just sort of dominate and ultimately it all ends up being the same?
I guess I would ask the objective of the study, because there's an underlying assumption behind that, which is more loopiness of rope in the water means more entanglement risk. And it makes intuitive sense, but we just don't know that. And so I think the ability to design experiments or trials, or what we're doing now with computer simulations, to actually understand if those different profiles do lead to greater entanglement risk, I think that would be worthwhile. I will say on the East Coast, the fishermen tend to use a lot of scope on their line. They tend to increase the length a lot longer than the depth of the water because of currents, so that if they're motoring out and they want to retrieve their gear, if the current is really strong, then even their buoys are underwater. So it makes it really hard for them to see their gear and retrieve their gear. So they tend to resolve that by increasing the scope of the line, which increases the probability that the buoy will be up at the surface and they'll be able to find it and haul it. So if you reduce the scope, then you're making it harder for a fisherman to be able to get to the gear, except in when the currents are totally slack and the buoy would tend to be at the surface.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, this brings up for me, Dennis, this trade-off we've continuously talked about of single trap per line versus multiple traps per line. And I mean, the basic discussion is, if you have multiple traps per line, you could fish the same amount of traps, and say you did 3 per line, right? Then you could reduce by 2/3 the potential, the number of vertical lines, and hence the probability of entanglement. But I think, as we've seen, when you've got the more weight you have, the severity of the entanglement goes up. And I guess we've struggled with that, because maybe if there's more, it's like, is it better to have more entangled whales that are able to swim around, that could potentially throw the gear off themselves or get disentangled, versus have the kind of more seriously lethal, but have that be a more unusual occurrence? I guess we've struggled with that, and there's also kind of trade-offs there between, I mean, when we first brought this up at the working group, it was just kind of off the table, because a lot of the fishermen didn't want to do multiple traps per line, because there's a lot of just reasons for that, just in terms of the nature of the fishing operation. So, yeah, safety risks, et cetera. So, I mean, I don't know which of these is better. It kind of gets to your question of the tautness of the rope, and whether there's a lot of slack or not. But I think these are some of the trade-offs we're still struggling with. Is right now, as you know, it's not legal to put more than 1 trap per line on Dungeness crab, and we've got some interest by some fishermen in actually trying that out and just kind of seeing what that would look like. And I think with the ropeless gear example, because of the high cost of those, it may only make economic sense to have multiple traps on one. And then, of course, there's the kind of idea of the ground line between the traps. Is that, if gray whales are in there, are they going to get more entanglements? Is there, we know they scoop up sediments and right on the seafloor. So these are things that, I guess, trade-offs that are hard to assess. And I don't know. I think we're interested in kind of looking at that from the operational aspect of multiple traps per line, but in terms of the effect on whales and probability of risk versus severity of the risk, I don't think we have a clear answer on that, and we'd love some advice from the commission or others.
I just have a quick comment too, Dennis, just so you know, since we're talking about East Coast and West Coast, from the gear side of things, the rope that we use on the West Coast is incredibly hard. It's very stiff, very hard, compared to what they use on the East Coast. I'm sure Dick can verify you can't basically open the rope to splice it. So we're already using a very, very stiff line over here. And I just have one comment, since we're getting kind of low on time. Kind of a reverse thought here. We've had this tremendous spike in the last 4 or 5 years. What were we doing right before? Was there something we can look at to say, prior to this, why did we have virtually no entanglements? Why in Oregon currently are there virtually no entanglements? So it's kind of, we're looking at the spike and everything, but what were we doing before then?
Well, have the fisheries the fishery in the 3 states remained relatively the same through the period of time? True in California too? Or has anything changed on the fishery side? That's the question.
Well, I mean, I think from an overall picture, it might be easy to say, well, sure, there's not much changed. You know, lots of fishermen, lots of gear out, lots of the year. You know, I think there are maybe some differences that we can at least point to a little bit in California. That absence of a normal start where most of the effort goes out in the winter, successfully harvest a large chunk of the resource, and then folks start to get out of the fishery. There's been some anomalies there in recent years in terms of now you have a springtime crab fishery looking more like the wintertime crab fishery. So, I mean, that's a definite difference, and we saw what that, you know, led to fairly immediately, indirectly. There seems to be a growing sense, as I speak to fishermen up and down the coast, that there has been some movement of gear deeper and deeper. You know, whether that's a more very recent thing or a slow tread over time, and whether anything related to just the lines or maybe the crab resource has just been heading that way. So I don't know that that's a sort of a definitive thing I can point to, but that's a sense that I'm getting, that we have had people fish deeper and deeper, and that could be sort of just increasing this exposure, and maybe that's a more local thing and not spread throughout everywhere yet. But I mean, those are just the first couple things that come to my mind right away that are different.
And maybe just, oh, sorry, Dave, is it okay? Just building on that. I think that NMFS's efforts to increase public awareness and the reporting of entanglements has potentially shifted over this time. And Dick can speak to this way more than I can. But it is interesting to think about the cyclical nature of Dungeness crab, at least in California, where it's sort of on this 10-year decadal cycle, not perfect, but sort of moving up and down the coast. And it just happened during this very unfortunate 2015, acknowledging there were still high levels of entanglements in 2014 and it was building, but this 2015-16 season where you had this high concentration of crab and therefore gear in the southern part of the state, or the central part of the state, that's something to be mindful of. And then something that comes up for me, which is interesting, also, is that the Dungeness crab fishery in California, and again, Dick, make sure I have this right, but I believe it was the 2013-14 fishing season that the trap limit program that you had, or was it 2012-13? 12-13. So the 2012-13 season was the start of the California commercial trap limit program, hence identifiable buoy markings and gear on their fishing gear. And so that also then allowed for gear that may have been identifiable in the past, again, acknowledging that didn't change the rate of entanglements necessarily, but at least the ability to see what was being entangled.
Dan, yeah.
Just very briefly, and I've got a couple things in my head, but Washington's had mandatory gear marking with pot limits since 2001, and yet we've still seen a very big increase in, and they're not just whales that are being seen at sea, but whales that are entangled on the beach that are very, very hard to ignore and easily reported. And I can say in my career, it's only been in the recent years that I've ever seen any whale with crab gear on it on the beach. And part of my responsibility is another fishery that requires a lot of time on the beach. So with that said, I just also want to say that we've been asking that same question, Sheila, in the last few weeks with this desperate increase in the number of whales entangled in Washington crab gear. We did a quick logbook review to make sure that crab gear isn't being distributed in some unusual way, and it's not. And anecdotally, our fishermen are telling us they're seeing whales in places they've never seen them before this early in the year. And they're also telling us there's a lot of bait in the near shore, krill specifically. We don't have any data to tell you about, but whether that lends any credence to some reason why we're seeing this spike in entanglements on our shoreline. I mean, we're scratching our heads too, wondering what is happening. It's almost a weekly occurrence here. So.
And I would just say that I think the general thinking, at least that I have, is that in answer to number one on the list of questions, I mean, there does seem to be a whole set of, a perfect storm of events that happened, right? There was more crab in the Central California area, more whales in that area in the near shore based on where the forage was, changes in the start, people fishing later. I'm not sure that necessarily we should expect that those are going to be sustained at this high level. I mean, I think it will come up and down, but I think the main motivating factor is if this happened this time, it's bound to happen again. And how can we be better prepared when it does happen? And how can we design an early warning response system to detect when those anomalous conditions that are likely to happen again are actually happening, and distinguishing that from kind of the overall noise that's out there. And one thing that a local fisherman in Monterey Bay also said is that, and you can take this for what it's worth, it gets to your question of density that I think was raised earlier, was the right around some of the marine protected areas. There's one in Monterey, the Soquel Canyon Marine Protected Area. That's a hot spot for blue whales and humpbacks, consistently, every year, big krill upwelling spot. There's a protected area right around it. So right on the edges, there is basically an ungodly number of traps that are fishing the edge of a protected area. And so this fisherman is convinced that basically the protected area has had this unintended consequence of people fishing the line and having a higher density than you would otherwise see if there wasn't that, I think, which is an important consideration in any of these kind of spatial, time area closures. The idea that there's an incentive to then fish the line, and that could create a kind of basically he said he wasn't surprised that whales have been entangled in that area, and until something's done about that, there's going to be a consistent issue there. So those are a couple thoughts.
Thanks. That's great. I mean, great conversation. And I want to make sure, once again, since we have 5 minutes left exactly, that the so-called observers or the audience have a chance to ask questions or make comments. And I see one, so please do it. And I see another one. So tell us who you are.
My name is Jen Tackerberry. I work for Cascadia Research, and prior to that I was at the Center for Coastal Studies, so I'm a level 4 disentangler. And my question was mostly for Tim. I know a lot of our entanglements start in the mouth, so regardless of where they end up on the body, when we find them, they begin there. So we've started talking about testing on carcasses when they wash ashore with lines in the baleen, depending on the different species, and I was wondering if there has been any effort, since I'm sort of out of the loop on the East Coast stuff, for running like those stiff lines through the baleen, and for the different species, since the baleen differs quite a bit.
We've talked about it, including with some vets out in the Northeast, but we haven't done anything yet. We did have what we called a reverse engineering workshop a few years ago, where we had fishermen and disentanglers and whale biologists come together and kind of forensically go through entanglement case studies and the different gear involved, and came to a very similar conclusion that the entanglements that seem to endure probably occurred initially in the head region rather than at the flipper or behind. Yeah, it would be useful to do, but we haven't done anything there yet. But there are people at Center for Coastal Studies that tell me they've seen all types of heavy-duty stiff rope, and they don't believe any rope can be changed that won't entangle a whale. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've been told.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Phil?
Phil Clapham, Marine Mammal Lab here. Just a comment on the Washington State situation. This is a very resilient species, and as some of you probably know, humpbacks in Washington State were severely reduced by whaling primarily in the 1920s. This population is coming back. This is very typical of what humpbacks do in most places in the world. They've come back really strongly from whaling. I think they're going to be coming back more and more, and so you're going to be seeing more and more humpbacks in the future. We're starting to see them in places we haven't seen them, as you said, for a while. It's not true that they haven't been there. They used to be here in pretty significant numbers and were whaled down. So unfortunately, it's great for the whales in terms of the population size, but you are going to be seeing increasing entanglements likely because of that population increase.
Thanks, Phil. I would ask, Dan probably would be the best one to talk to it, but what about Dungeness crab fishing and other pot or trap fisheries northward from Washington in British Columbia, for example? I assume the Dungeness crab fishery is big there too.
Which other pot fisheries there are? Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
There's a sablefish pot fishery that's much smaller and farther offshore. And we have a very small spot shrimp fishery that's a pot fishery, but it's a total of 8 fishers. That's
We're talking in British Columbia.
That's
what I mean. Columbia. North of Washington is what I was wondering if the Dungeness fishery.
Dungeness crab fishery certainly is present in British Columbia as well.
Yeah. So
more of it occurs on the inside of Vancouver Island than on the outside, but there is Dungeness crab fishing.
I mean, so humpbacks are there too, and there's going to be more, as Phil says. So.
Yeah, and certainly in Alaska as well. So.
Yeah. So we're only looking at part of the problem here. Francis?
Can I?
Oh, sorry. Okay. We go first.
Before we end our discussion here, I would just like to encourage the support of these working groups and working with fishermen. I've been to quite a few of these entanglement meetings, and the ratio of government agencies, NGOs, and all that, 18 agency people and 2 fishermen. It's very important, I think, to work with the industry. They're on the water 24/7. They have great ideas, innovators. We just don't know how to access, I think, you folks somehow. But with the working groups and Dan and those guys, it's getting better and better. But I definitely would encourage to include the industry a lot more in these types of meetings and discussions.
Thanks. I'm sure Tim would reinforce that. That's what he does. Francis? That should be the last comment, I guess.
Thank you, Sheila. And actually, I wanted to build exactly on that comment and really to ask Dick Ogg, as the single fisherman here, outnumbered by us lot. We've heard about these prototypes. There are at least 3 or 4 ropeless prototypes that are out there, and I know that you've worked with a couple. So, how can the Commission help increase the scale of these trials and facilitate? Obviously, you need to adapt these prototypes by actually using them and working with the geeks that make them. So how can we scale that up and increase the speed that of that process? Because that's obviously the solution. I mean, do we buy you gas? Do we get your friends in the room? Do we hold a workshop? I mean, do we facilitate more of the working group activities?
Francis, it's really hard to get a buy-in from the fishermen because of the feeling of lack of practicality. And so I think we've really got to sit back and kind of not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but take it and find ways to apply it directly to our industry and how we run our gear and what we can do to make it simpler and safer and more reliable. It needs to be tried. We need the opportunity to try. And there's a few of us that are willing to do it. And I know personally I'll do anything I can to help, any way I can make it work. But I think it's just a matter of trying.
We are out of time, but one quick.
Well, just not the fisherman's perspective, but from the perspective of some of the gear manufacturers that we've worked with, I think there's definitely some significant interest, and obviously they see a profit opportunity if this does get large scale buy-in, and so I think that a lot of them are willing to donate some of their prototypes at cost, and I think just being able to find the few fishermen like Dick who are not necessarily believers yet. That I think everybody should be skeptical, but there are a number of fishermen I think that are interested in trying this, and then kind of getting this in the hands of them and having the gear manufacturers be a part of it. I think they're sincerely motivated to do it. So. Any sort of support and a more coordinated kind of longer term effort to build on a pilot, I think would be really helpful. Thanks.
Of course.
It's just an announcement.
This is in, what do they call, injury time or something
Can I
like that?
say
Go
just
ahead.
one thing? The other question in regard to ropeless gear that we really need to work on is the reason there's one buoy per pot is that's how we enforce our pot limits. And pot limits are really important to the management of the fishery. And the pot limits themselves brought the number of pots in the water down by at least 50% in Washington in 2001 because they went from using an unlimited number of pots down to 500. But when you start using ropeless gear, it's going to make it much more difficult for us to manage how much gear is in the water. And
Yep.
pot limits are really important to what we do. So.
Yep. Okay. I just got that from the chairman, and I just want to thank Dennis for organizing this, and a big thanks to the panel members for a really, I think, constructive discussion. Thanks very much.
Don't go anywhere. We have another session following directly on from this one.
One thing is, if you want, you have to use, there's no pointer. So the cursor is your pointer. And so just look at that screen, so slide it all the way over. So it's all right. Hello again, everyone. We're switching now from large whales to wee porpoises. Talk about harbor porpoises in Southeast Alaska. And we have 3 presentations today, and we're going to hold questions until the end of the session. And just a bit of background, harbor porpoises, we all know, are well known for their interactions with commercial gillnet fisheries worldwide, and Southeast Alaska is no exception. The most recent stock assessments for this group of porpoises estimates that the number of deaths and serious injuries due to entanglement is at least 4 times higher than allowable levels under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And there's additional other bycatch in other coastal gillnet fisheries that's probably unaccounted for at this time. And with the considerable uncertainties in stock structure, abundance estimates, and bycatch rates for the stock, it's very difficult to assess fully the status of the stock. So the goals today of this session are going to be we're going to hear some updates on abundance, bycatch, and stock structure, and then hopefully use that information to consider what other science needs there may be to improve our understanding of the impact of this bycatch on this stock, and then whether there are any potential mitigation measures that might be taken to reduce porpoise bycatch in this area. So we have 3 speakers. I'll introduce them all now. Our first speaker is Dr. Alex Zerbini, and he's going to present information on the abundance and trends for harbor porpoises in the area. He works with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center and has primary research interests in population ecology assessment, conservation and management of cetaceans particularly large whales, but now he's working on small whales, small porpoises. Our second speaker is Christy Long, and she's going to provide an update on bycatch estimates and implications to the stock and implications for management. And Christy is a fisheries biologist in the Marine Mammal and Sea Turtle Conservation Division of the NMFS Office of Protected Resources. And then our final speaker will be Dr. Kim Parsons, who's going to provide an update on her ongoing research on using environmental DNA, or eDNA, to investigate stock structure for Southeast Alaska Harbor porpoise for the stock. Kim works at the Northwest Fisheries Center and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and her primary research focuses on genetic structuring of marine mammal populations, again, as it pertains to conservation and management objectives. So with that, we'll start with Alex.
Thank you, Patty. So I want to start by thanking the Marine Mammal Commission for inviting me to come here today and talk about harbor porpoise and abundance and trends in Southeast Alaska. And also would like to thank the contributors to the information that I'm presenting. I'm actually summarizing research that has been done by the Marine Mammal Laboratory of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center for many decades. And the people involved in these studies are primarily Marilyn Dalheim, Rod Hobbs, and York, and Janice Waite, and also Paul Wade and Phil Clapham have contributed with discussions about the data and the analysis that are going to be shown here. So since I was the first one talking about the Southeast Alaska Harbor porpoise, I thought it would be useful for us to situate ourselves on the map. I like maps, and you see many of them in this presentation. Currently, we have 3 stocks of harbor porpoise recognized for Alaska. The Bering Sea stock ranges from Point Barrow to Unimak Pass and include the Aleutian Islands. The Gulf of Alaska stock ranges from Unimak Pass to Cape Suckling. And the Southeast Alaska stock, which is the one that we're going to focus here, from Cape Suckling to Dixon Entrance. And it also includes the inland waters of Southeast Alaska, which I hope, well, I will, and I think both Christy and Kim are going to cover in detail in their presentations. Just to give you an overview of what I'm planning to do, I'm going to provide information on abundance and trends for the Southeast Alaska Harbor porpoise stock, discuss some of the limitations, or briefly discuss some of the limitations of the abundance surveys and the estimates, and provide an evaluation of if the effects of bycatch to potential substocks within Southeast Alaska inland waters. The information that I'm presenting comes primarily from 3 surveys, 2 aerial surveys, one conducted in 1993, another one in 1997, and then a ship survey, or ship surveys that have been conducted since the early 1990s in inland waters of Southeast Alaska. So looking at estimates that we have, we have an abundance estimate of about 10,000 individuals in 1993. This comes from an aerial survey. It combines the aerial survey and a ship survey. The panel on the left shows the coverage of the aerial survey, and the map on the right of the ship survey. We have another estimate for 1997, which is about 11,000 harbor porpoise. That was calculating combining data from aerial surveys in both inside and offshore waters of Southeast Alaska. Both the aerial surveys were, both the aerial surveys were corrected for animals missed on the track lines. As you know, harbor porpoise are hard to see, and often animals are missed both on aerial surveys, so G0 corrections are very, very important. And both of those aerial surveys had those corrections. So speaking a little bit about ship surveys, we have estimates from 3 time periods, 1991 to 1993, 2006 and 2007, and 2010 and 2012. These estimates were computed only in inside waters of Southeast Alaska, which explain the numbers much smaller than those obtained with the aerial survey, so an order of magnitude less on the estimates computed by the ship surveys. And the surveys are not corrected for G0. There were no types of, no kind of experiments, like double platform experiments on the ship surveys to correct for G0. This is the only survey that provides time series of information on trends. If you look at the three estimates that I'm presenting here, you can see that there was a steep decline from the early 90s to the mid-2000s, and then an increase again in abundance. If we were to fit a linear model to this data, we would estimate an about 1% per year decline, but that decline is not statistically significant. So discussing a bit of the limitations of these estimates, all aerial survey-based estimates are more than 20 years old. We know from our stock assessment guidelines that we should use estimates that are less than 8 years old in management. So those estimates are not useful, at least for management purposes. The estimates of aerial surveys, even though the numbers are similar and they have been corrected for animals missed, they're difficult to compare. The aerial surveys use different sampling methodologies, and the estimates actually do not correspond to the exact same area. The most recent survey, ship survey, the estimate for the period 2010-2012 will, I use the word obsolete for management after 2019. Again, this is the guidelines from the stock assessment. If an abundance estimate is more than 8 years old, it's not expected to be used. So we'll soon run out of abundance estimates that are useful for management for harbor porpoise in Southeast Alaska. And again, the ship surveys were not designed to sample all harbor porpoise habitat. They focused on the inland waters of Southeast Alaska. There was no, we didn't compute G0, and the survey design is such that the survey did not achieve uniform coverage probability. So I'd like to cover some stock assessment considerations. One interesting aspect of the ship surveys is that the data reveal potential for substructure of harbor porpoise populations in Southeast Alaska. So we have here two maps of two surveys conducted 20 years apart, and some of the areas where harbor porpoise were rarely or never observed were documented during this cruises, suggesting a possible discontinued distribution or areas of very low density, with two potential populations in inland waters. One in the northern, which include Frederick Sound, Glacier Bay, Icy Strait, and Lynn Canal, and the other in the south, which includes Zarembo and Wrangell. Evidence for population substructure is also found in the trend data. This figure shows the time series of abundance estimates computed from the ship surveys for the two regions. The northern population is shown in red, remained relatively stable, while the southern population fluctuated between the early 1990s and 2012. If they were the same stock, we would expect the populations to do similar things, and this is not the case. We're currently assessing whether there are multiple populations within inland waters of Southeast Alaska, and I think Kim will give us some new information on that. So, given that we have bycatch data for specific areas in Southeast Alaska, there was a need to compare the bycatch and the abundance estimates in some of these areas. In 2012 and 2013, the Southeast Alaska salmon drift net fishery was observed by the AMOP program, and estimates of mortality and serious injuries were calculated. And Christy will get into the details of that. But what we did is, despite some of the caveats I mentioned in our ship surveys, we used that data to compute NMIN and PBR for the inland waters of Southeast Alaska for comparison with those mortality estimates. So what we see here is a table with the abundance estimates, the NMIN, the CVs and means, and the PBR. And what I want to point out is that the mortality estimate is greater than the PBR if we consider all inland waters and also each region independently. So one of the limitations of our survey is that no correction factor for animals missed on the track line were computed, and to potentially account for this, and so what that happens, it results in an underestimate. So to potentially account for that and also compare, or maybe provide a better comparison with PBR, we recomputed the abundance estimates from the ship surveys, the NMINs and the PBR, using an average G0 for harbor porpoise surveys conducted in California and the East Coast. And With that, so this is provided in that table, and even with some G0 calculation, which is consistent with other surveys, our PBR calculations are still below the annual bycatch. So what I wanted to mention here is our computation of PBR highlights the potential conservation problem for harbor porpoise in Southeast Alaska. Christy will present details, but because the fisheries in some districts have not been observed, the annual bycatch estimates are also likely biased low. Looking to the future, though, what do we need for, at least from the perspective of the abundance estimation, if we want to properly assess the impact of bycatch and serious injuries in the Southeast Alaska harbor porpoise stock, we need new properly designed abundance surveys. We need surveys that sample harbor porpoise habitat consistently and cover inside and offshore waters simultaneously. We need concurrent estimation of correction factors for animals missed on the track line. And if we can achieve that, then that will allow us to look into the potential issue of the bycatch, and then even allow us to do better comparisons of our density estimates in smaller areas to fishing effort, which is what we did with the inland waters. With that, I thank you, and I think I'm a little over time, but thank you.
Hello, I'm Christy Long. I work in the Office of Protected Resources, and I coordinate our National Marine Mammal Take Reduction Program. And most of what I'm presenting today is work that's been done by the Alaska Region and the Alaska Center. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Alaska Marine Mammal Observer Program to provide some context, and then go through our recent observer coverage, the resulting bycatch estimates, and the context for Southeast Alaska Harbor Porpoise, and then just quickly touch on some next steps. So just to give you an overview of the Alaska Marine Mammal Observer Program, it began in 1990. The Alaska region ran the program since that time. The purpose was to observe the state of Alaska gillnet fisheries. And the reason why this program was pulled out by itself is because the scope of observing state fisheries in Alaska is so great. There's really remote areas, lots of vessels, and we were very concerned about harbor porpoise in general and gillnet fisheries. So you can see here that there are 11 fisheries that we've got on the list. We've observed 8 of them. The purpose was to rotate through, so observe them for a couple years, move on to the next fishery. So since 1990, we've only observed 8 of those. Our most recent coverage was in the Southeast Alaska drift gillnet fishery, and that's where I'm going to focus today. So Alex already showed you this map. There are 5 management districts that are where the traditional gillnet effort occurs in Southeast Alaska. We observed management districts 6 and 8, primarily because we thought that's where the greatest overlap would be between porpoise distribution and the fishing effort. We got a little bit of coverage in Area 7A, which is actually a terminal harvest area, and that was just sort of a byproduct of where the fishermen were fishing that day. So in terms of our coverage rate, we got about 6.5%. In 2012, it was about 6.4, 2013, 6.6. You can see the number of permits in each of the districts. It hovers around 450. So in terms of observed bycatch, the 2 years were pretty different. 2012, we only observed 1 marine mammal, that was Dahl's porpoise, and 13 seabirds. In 2013, you can see there were 6 marine mammals and just shy of 100 seabirds. And one of the possible reasons that could explain the differences in the bycatch is that 2013 fishing effort was substantially higher because of really strong pink and coho runs toward the end of the season. You'll see there that I've pointed out which of the observed marine mammal takes were serious injuries or not serious injuries. So this is just a map. Hopefully you can kind of differentiate between the symbols there of where the marine mammal takes occurred. So there were 4 harbor porpoise, like I mentioned, 2 in District 6 and 2 in District 8. Those are denoted by the squares. So looking at what this means, what those observed takes mean in terms of the estimated mortality and serious injury, for harbor porpoise in particular, those 2 serious injuries translated into an estimate of 23 animals. So that leaves us with an annual estimate of 12 animals. And you'll see I pointed out on the screen that we did not extrapolate the sea otter takes because we haven't done injury determinations on those because they're fish and wildlife species. So just to give you a little bit more context in terms of the numbers that we saw in the observer program for harbor porpoise, in 1990, a logbook program began to, this was the precursor to Section 118 that created the National Marine Mammal Take Reduction Program in 1994. And there was an exemption program for fishermen provided that they reported marine mammal takes. So in just a 4-year time span, they reported 13 harbor porpoise takes. And then once the 94 amendments were implemented and the Commercial Fisheries Interactions Program began in 1996 to 2017, there were just 10 reported harbor porpoise. And one of those was in 2013, which overlapped with the observer coverage that we had. So Alex alluded to this already, but in terms of the Southeast Alaska stock, right now, the mortality and serious injury that we have in our stock assessment report, this is from the most recent stock assessment report, is the Yakutat salmon gillnet fishery. There's an annual estimate of 22 animals, and then Southeast Alaska drift gillnet is 12. So we know there's a minimum total estimated annual mortality of 34 animals, and this is just 2 fisheries that interact with this particular stock as it's been delineated in the stock assessment report. So mortality and serious injury exceeds PBR. So that means that the triggers have been met for convening a take reduction team under the MMPA. So, you know, that's a category 1 or 2 fishery that's interacting with a strategic stock. This stock is strategic because mortality and serious injury exceed PBR. So we have a number of existing take reduction teams and take reduction plans around the country already. The MMPA allows us to prioritize which stocks and fisheries that we choose to convene a TRT for, given that we don't have the resources to do all of them simultaneously. So in terms of what we're doing about this problem, given that prioritization, we really are focusing on our data collection to get a really good handle on abundance estimates, bycatch estimates, particularly for the 3 other management districts that we have not yet observed, potentially going back into the 2 that we have observed, given that there was a high amount of variability in the bycatch observed over the 2 years of the program. And, you know, this is sort of the minimum set of information that we found over, you know, 20 years of convening take reduction teams, is that this is what a team really needs to deliberate and successfully make recommendations to the agency on reducing bycatch. So we don't feel like we're at a place right now where we could potentially do that. As Alex just mentioned, there are some limitations with the abundance estimates that we have, and in fact, they're going to expire next year. And then also we've got some questions on stock structure, and we are continuing to evaluate that, which you'll hear about in Kim's talk next. There are a number of considerations with respect to pingers. We know that some pingers are being used in the fishery right now. Some of those are harbor porpoise pingers, the 10 kilohertz pingers, but they're also using whale pingers. And we have some data on that from the 2012-2013 program that we're looking into to see if there was any information that we can glean from that. And then, you know, thinking about should we potentially undertake some sort of pinger experiment in the interim while we're trying to gear up and go through this data collection phase. And then we are also formally updating our NIMS priorities for convening TRTs with the new information here. And so I'll just leave it there, ask if there's any questions. I think I have some time. Yeah. Oh, Dee.
Christy, given that you're dealing with state fisheries here, what, if any, are the obligations of the state of Alaska for putting out observers or reporting or requiring reporting of marine mammal takes?
So the MMPA requires that fishermen report injuries or mortalities within 48 hours after the completion of a trip. So that number that I showed you, the 10 animals that were reported between 1996 and 2017, is obviously a way underestimate. But the state doesn't necessarily have to do anything because that's a federal requirement. In terms of managing the fishery for marine mammal bycatch, we have the authority to do that under the MMPA. I mean, of course, we'd want the state involved if we were going to do anything like that. If we were going to convene a TRT, the state would certainly be a part of that effort. Phil's question.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I just wanted to note with regard to abundance estimates, as was said, the abundance estimates for this stock currently are going to expire shortly. Those abundance estimates were the result of surveys that were done a number of times, as Alex pointed out, and they were done with what was called the COB replacement funds, which allowed us to charter a boat to do this. I would note that this year those funds were withdrawn, and as a result we currently have no way of conducting further surveys unless money is made available. So if the Commission felt it was appropriate to try to restore those funds or to investigate that further, I think that would very much help, because we really do need new estimates on this population in addition to the other information such as population structure. Thanks.
One more question, Christy. Francis? Sorry, just a quick question from sort of my ignorance. Is there the question of pingers, and you have as a bullet, consider research on mitigation measures. Is there a reason to believe they would react differently to pingers than East Coast harbor porpoises? Or do we need more research?
Yeah, so Tim actually probably could speak to this better than me, but pingers do not work universally around the world for harbor porpoise. I know they've tried them in Iceland, and they do not work in Iceland. So it's definitely, I mean, it could be a very different habitat here. I mean, you think about where we require pingers in the U.S., that's off California and off the northeast U.S., and that's a very different habitat than Southeast Alaska inland waters. So I think it's probably worth evaluating. Aaron? Am I allowed to call him?
Yes, thank you. This is a question for Alex.
Oh, wait.
Oh.
Do you mind if we wait till we get the last talk in before we broaden?
I will reluctantly remain quiet.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I want to make sure we have time for all three presentations. And I know we're running a little bit late.
Okay, so following on from that, you've had a nice introduction to Southeast Alaska Harbor porpoise. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about stock structure of harbor porpoise and some of the data gaps that exist and what we're doing to address those at the moment. So as Alex mentioned, and Christy followed up, we have a number of lines of evidence to suggest that within the currently recognized Southeast Alaska stock of harbor porpoise, there may be multiple populations and potentially should be recognized as different stocks. That's indicated both by the difference in temporal trends in abundance between the northern area and the southern area, which I've sort of broadly indicated here with the colored rectangles, and also with the hiatus in distribution. And so the question is, what are we looking at in terms of contemporary stock structure? So a little bit of background. Harbor porpoise population stock structure has been looked at in a number of different regions globally. And in the Northwest Atlantic, there has been evidence for multiple management units, including some of the work done by Patty Rozelle. And we've seen evidence for fine-scale structure in areas such as the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the North Sea as well. There's also been evidence for broad-scale population structure within the harbor porpoise in the Northeast Pacific. And these studies are all based on a combination of mitochondrial sequence data and or nuclear genotyping. Susan Shiver's work in 2002 suggested that harbor porpoise in the Northeast Atlantic probably warrant multiple management units. But unfortunately, within her study, the number of samples within Alaska was really quite restricted simply because of availability of samples. Most of those samples were obtained through strandings and bycatch. Interestingly, there's been a recent study of harbor porpoise in southern British Columbia looking at harbor porpoise inside and outside of Vancouver Island in the inner waters of British Columbia, suggesting that in that area, based on the study that they did, using both mitochondrial and nuclear microsats, that the porpoise around British Columbia comprised most likely a single stock. Now, one of the interesting things about the Crossman study is that they, in addition to looking at stock structure, they also looked for the presence and identification, genetic identification of hybrids. So harbor porpoise and Dall's porpoise are hybridizing in the Northeast Pacific. And one of the things that Carla Crossman and Lance Barrett-Leonard found is that about 10% of their samples were identified to be genetic hybrids between harbors and Dall's. And they suggested that this may be one of the explanations for the fact that earlier studies suggested multiple populations and the current study suggests a single, perhaps because of the inclusion of hybrids in earlier work. So what are we doing in Alaska? We've done our best efforts to collect strandings and bycatch through an amazing strandings network throughout Alaska. And these samples have been collected since about 1988. So it's taken us this long to amass a collection of about 100 samples. And you can see the distribution of the samples here in the map. We're using a combination of approaches to analyze these samples, including both mitochondrial control region sequence data, to look for significant genetic differences between some of the areas based on a priori determination of regions or groups that are assigned based on geographic distribution of samples and breaks between the collection areas. In order to better understand the Alaska sample and put it into the perspective of the larger Eastern North Pacific, we're also collaborating with Phil Morin and folks down at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center to look at harbor porpoise stock structure throughout the entire coastline from Alaska down through British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. So in addition, we're looking at the same control region sequence data here and also looking at nuclear SNPs. And hoping to get a better picture of the geographic scale of harbor porpoise populations, as well as what some of the significant factors may be driving the stock structure. We're also hoping to look at the presence of hybrids throughout the range to see what some of the factors are that may be determining how frequent hybrids are occurring and in what areas. I should mention that this work is in the early phases of analysis. We've got the data. It's taken a little while to acquire the data. We had a few technical hitches, but it's promising. Just to give you a glimpse of what we're seeing so far based on the Alaska region, I've kind of drawn some rough areas around a priori groups based on the colored shapes that you can see here. The colors of the dots indicate the location of a sample, and the color just indicates the region, the a priori group that it was assigned to. You can see below those the phi-ST and FST estimates that have been calculated so far. And the phi-ST estimates are from mitochondrial sequence data, and the FST estimates are from the nuclear SNPs that we've generated, those 300 SNP loci. So we can start to see some significant genetic differentiation between these regions. But one of the key areas of interest is obviously Southeast Alaska, and I want to highlight here the number of samples that we have. You can see here the dark blue represent samples that would be considered part of that northern potential stock, and the purple dots indicate samples that would be considered part of the southern stock. So we only have 3 samples in this potentially southern area. And these are all samples, just a reminder, that were collected through strandings and bycatch. So based on the strandings and bycatch data, we really can't say definitively conduct a statistically relevant analysis based on such low sample numbers. But I'm hopeful that looking at the other regions throughout the eastern North Pacific is going to give us some indication of the patterns that we're seeing throughout the area. So the last few years, we've been doing our best to increase sample size for Southeast Alaska, considering the data that we have from the abundance estimates, et cetera. We attempted remote tissue biopsy to collect additional samples. And as you can imagine, for harbor porpoise, this is incredibly challenging, and had to move on to other methods, considering that we were only acquiring about 1 sample per each 2-week survey. And that's where environmental DNA comes in. And so hopefully you remember a little bit about this from Scott's talk a couple of days ago. This is just environmental DNA is DNA that's shed by organisms into their environment, and we can detect it using highly sensitive genetic methods. In 2015, we initiated a pilot study to see whether or not we could successfully detect harbor porpoise in seawater samples, and found that it was working quite well for detection, and moved on from there to collect a more dedicated way of collecting samples from seawater from harbor porpoise in areas where there were high distribution. So this is just a quick flow chart giving you an indication of what our workflow is. So we scoop up seawater samples in the fluke prints of the harbor porpoise. We're collecting about 3 liters at a time. That water's filtered down onto a 0.45 micron filter, and the DNA is extracted off of there. We're using species-specific markers for both qPCR, or quantitative PCR, and next-generation sequencing to generate high-depth sequencing for each of these water samples. And then through bioinformatic processing, we can generate the haplotypes, the mitochondrial haplotypes, for the harbor porpoise from which the seawater sample was collected. Just quickly, the species-specific qPCR was used to detect harbor porpoise to see whether or not we have harbor porpoise DNA in the seawater sample, and also to identify samples that may have some indication of inhibitors. We had a high success rate with only 11 out of 118 eDNA samples fail. And the mean concentration of DNA in each of these samples was orders of magnitude lower than we would expect from tissue samples, which is not surprising considering our source. But what we really need in order to make this informative for the purpose of looking at stock structure is we need that harbor porpoise sequence data. We need the data that is comparable to the sequences that we're generating from tissue samples. For this, we use next-generation sequencing based on using the Illumina MySeq sequencer. We chose 40 of the seawater eDNA samples, that half and half representing both the north and south area, and generated a pooled library to sequence on a single flow cell. And we used tissue samples to generate controls that allowed us to estimate a kind of a threshold level that would be indicative of sequencing error to help us differentiate between high-quality sequence reads and things that would potentially be error. We generated high-quality harbor porpoise mitochondrial DNA sequences for 30 out of 36 samples, and 9 of different mitochondrial haplotypes within those, 7 of which were previously identified. So you can see here the nodes that you can just make out in red are the new haplotypes, and the ones in black are haplotypes that were generated from tissue, and then you can see how the blue samples that are the eDNA samples cluster with the black ones simply indicates identity with previously known haplotypes. Most of the samples contained only a single mitochondrial haplotype. 3 of them contained 2 haplotypes, both at high frequency. So to summarize here, what you can see is on the left-hand side, you can see a figure indicating the mitochondrial haplotypes and the locations from all the strandings and bicot samples, and our inability to distinguish significant genetic differentiation based on those using the FST or chi-squared metrics. On the right-hand side is the location of eDNA samples collected in 2016, and in areas of high porpoise density. And so far, what we're seeing is some evidence of significant genetic differentiation between these, based on the limited sampling to date. So this kind of gives us a multi-pronged approach to look at harbor porpoise stock structure with using the best methods available to us and developing some new methods based on eDNA. And the ability to generate kind of population-level sequence data from these eDNA samples in lieu of collecting tissue samples from harbor porpoise, such a challenging and evasive little critter. And this opportunity, this new method, kind of provides us with an opportunity to dovetail eDNA sampling with something like an abundance survey, where we could move through the survey area collecting eDNA samples in the wake of harbor porpoise throughout the survey area within a single season. So just quickly what we're doing to move forward with this, you can see you can sort of see the two yellow dots there that indicate the locations where eDNA samples were collected previously. And in collaboration with folks up in Alaska, we're hoping to get some opportunistic sampling this year in lieu of our abundance survey or eDNA sampling survey. And the red location indicators here show regions where we anticipate being able to collect samples, working closely with our collaborators to collect eDNA samples this year, hoping to cover the area much more broadly and generate sequence data for the greater region. And with that, thank you.
Okay, we're supposed to have about 10 minutes for questions. Are we still okay with that? Great, thank you. So we will take questions. I'll start again with the chairs and the CSA, and I would start with Aaron for his patience in holding his question if he still has it.
Yes, thank you. My question for Alex is that both Europe and the UK have used passive acoustics pretty extensively to measure distribution abundance of harbor porpoise. You know, the Baltic Sea, they deployed 500 acoustic recorders to get a pretty detailed map. Have there been any discussions about how to use this technology to survey the inside waters of Alaska?
Yes, we have discussed the use of acoustics, the passive acoustic monitoring to estimate abundance of harbor porpoise in Alaska. I think there are some limitations. First, much of the habitat is very, very, very deep. So setting I think the hydrophones in the bottom might be more difficult. And obviously the cost. I mean, it's just to set up a large number of acoustic recorders is probably expensive. But yeah, we have talked about this. And eventually, if we're going to do new surveys, that's going to be the inclusion of acoustic monitoring for estimating abundance is going to be considered.
Randy.
Yeah, I would be interested in that subject of hybridization with Dall's porpoises, because the 10% thing sounded pretty high to me. And not just Kim's perspective, but Patty's on how that might confound how it confounds. I realize it does confound to some extent the stock definition issue.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I'm really curious to see how it looks when we start analyzing the SNP data, because with that, it looks like we do have the power to distinguish and identify hybrids. We saw a really nice differentiation between harbor porpoise and Dall's porpoise, so identifying the hybrids should be quite straightforward. The one thing about the hybrids is that the frequency with which we're seeing them seems to be increasing over time. I know Robin can probably comment on this in terms of the Salish Sea. We were seeing hybrid porpoises years ago. They were really infrequent, and now they seem to be incredibly common. And I know from colleagues up in Alaska that they're seeing hybrids around Kodiak now as well. So it seems like something that may be increasing over time, and whether or not it's throughout the eastern North Pacific or specific to particular areas, I don't know. But it does beg an interesting question for management purposes.
Jason.
If I understand correctly, a lot of this focus on the southeast stock is because there was data from observers, and then there was at least a reasonably recent abundance estimate for part of the stock. I'm just wondering what the thoughts are about the other two stocks in terms of risk of take and status of those populations?
I don't have a good answer for that, Jason. This was the next fishery up in the queue that we felt like was the most important to observe. And so that's what led us down this path. I think, anywhere harbor porpoise and gillnets overlap, we know there's a problem. So I would expect there to be a problem elsewhere. We just haven't looked very hard.
Randy?
It does kind of bring us back to that question we talked about earlier about the fact that here's the science part of nymphs plowing ahead, trying to distinguish stocks, but already there's a backlog apparently in regard to recognizing them as an agency. I guess that might be discouraging for those of you who are doing what you're doing. Maybe not. Just thought I'd raise it again.
Well, I have a question, I think for Christy. So given there's this bycatch and some of it's being observed and not all of it's being reported, but the number of samples in Kim's study from the inner waters of Southeast Alaska is really low. Are you getting samples from the observed catch?
So unfortunately, when we ran the program in 2012 and 2013, the observers were not trained or equipped to collect biopsy samples. That said, there were only 4 animals, and the fishermen are really good about getting them out of the net really fast. So, the observers were on an alternate platform because the vessels are so small. The observers were on their own vessel, and they would go out and find the fishermen. So, it would have been theoretically possible, but they were not equipped to do it during that program. If we were to run the program again, we would make that possible.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, Christy, throughout western Alaska, northern Alaska, of course, the subsistence gillnet fisheries are pretty extensive, at least near villages. And I know for a while there were more harbor porpoise samples from Barrow than any place else in the state, which was kind of intriguing. But it's because people on the ground were collecting samples when harbor porpoise were caught. And it seems like reaching out to some of the tribal councils or some of the regional organizations may be a good way to better document takes in subsistence hunt or local commercial hunts, commercial fisheries or subsistence fisheries. It may be a better way to get additional samples and numbers from western and northern Alaska.
Sure, thank you. We will definitely talk with the Alaska region about that.
Robin?
Quick question on the hybridization from the Crossman et al. Paper. Is there evidence of directionality? Earlier samples, of course, were all showing that the hybridization was directional, with harbor porpoise being the fathers and the mothers being Dall's porpoise in all of the cases that were examined.
Yeah, I think that was the case for pretty much all the F1s, was that the Dall's porpoise was the mother. And so it was born into a Dall's porpoise group. There was some evidence for F2s, and the F2s seem to assign both ways, either have a harbor porpoise mitochondrial haplotype or a Dall's porpoise haplotype. So evidence that it was going both ways in subsequent generations. But I don't think any of the F1s looked like they were going with harbor porpoise dams.
Right?
Yeah, this is from the webinar from Gay Sheffield. We have great environmental marine changes in western Alaska at the ecosystem level. Will the Bering Sea stock be studied soon?
Let's take that one.
Well, I guess I'll answer that question since no one else is jumping up. At this point, we have no plans. Obviously, you're all hearing about our massive data needs, science needs, and management needs this week. So it's on the list.
Oh, okay, Robert.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, and Gay, thanks for your question. That, Christy, there's actually a fair amount of harbor porpoise data from industry in the Chukchi Sea that, between 2006 and 2014 or 15 or 16, something like that, harbor porpoises were the most frequently seen odontocetes in the Chukchi Sea, which blew me away. So there actually are some data from that area.
If there are no more questions from the front, I'd just like to have a minute and a half to open it to the audience. If there are any people in the audience who have any questions or any other web-based questions, and please state your name and affiliation. Paul.
Paul Wade from the Marine Mammal Lab here. Just a comment, actually, that to point out that bycatch estimate for Southeast could actually be negatively biased, because as Christy pointed out, secondary platform, and the guy who wrote up the report was a statistician. He didn't really get into the field methods of it, but if you look at it, you can find a table in there. There's a view code that the observer reports, and in both years, over 92% of the time, they gave a very poor view code, a number 3, which indicated that they couldn't see through the water at all, and also that up to 25 to 50% of the net was obstructed from their view. They couldn't even see it, and they weren't very close to the vessels. And they also report that the fishermen are pretty good at shaking the animals out of the net real quick. So it's possible that even with an observer there on the secondary platform, they might not be seeing all the bycatch. I just wanted to note that. Thanks.
Thank you. Christy?
And that could be one reason for the difference in the number of takes in 2012 and 2011 that the observer actually observed, because they got a little better with 1 year of experience of actually seeing the bycatch.
Doug?
Doug DeMaster, still Alaska Fisheries Science Center, one more day. Phil's comment on funding, just the Commission's aware there's kind of good news, bad news, or maybe bad news. But NMFS was able to get congressional authorization, as I think most people know, to fund for marine mammal research at the marine mammal level. Prior to 2017, we had lines that allowed money to go to stellar sea lion and sea lion research in Alaska. That was separate from any cetacean research. Now it's one pool for the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. If it's marine mammal funds, we can spend it on anything. So that means if this was considered a priority, we could move what used to be stellar sea lion, northern fur seal, harbor seal money over to the cetacean side. That's not done lightly, but that's possible now. It wasn't possible prior to 2017. A further note is that there's probably about a 30% reduction in the Marine Mammal Lab's operating budget this year that's going to support facility costs at AFSC. So there will be less funding chasing more of the issues that you've raised here. So that'll be a challenge, obviously, for the agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Are there any more questions from the Commission? Oh, yes, Robin.
Perhaps a question for Christy, but given Paul's comments about the difficulty observing these small boats, is there any discussion within the agency about electronic monitoring as an alternative for actually being able to capture some of those bycatch animals?
No, we have not thought about electronic monitoring for this fishery yet, but I suspect we will be soon.
All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming and giving your presentations. Thank you. And I'm turning this over now to Peter and Darrell.
Yeah, I just have one follow-up announcement. Tim Werner, in his desperate plea to Randy to get one more thing to say, wanted to announce and invite anyone from the audience to the Ropeless Consortium meeting, especially those involved in testing and developing gear. That's November 6, 2018 in New Bedford, and you should go to ropeless.org. Again, I hope folks haven't left the room who would want that message, but I think it's important to keep that connection between the East and the West Coasts.
Okay, we'll start up at the regular time, 1:30.